fluorescent lights in Pete's diner buzzed overhead, a chorus of angry wasps casting a sickly yellow glow on the peeling vinyl booths. I'd been planted here for hours, watching my reflection grow more haggard in the grimy window, endless cups of bitter coffee steaming beside me. The air hung thick with the scent of burnt toast and decades of cigarette smoke, a uniquely depressing atmosphere only truck-stop diners seemed capable of achieving. As Dennis slid into the booth across from me, his face looked worse than I remembered, deep lines etched into leathery skin, dark circles painting sleepless nights under his eyes. He looked a decade older since I'd last seen him, even though it couldn't have been more than a year. Still running routes, Greg? He rasped, his voice rough like gravel under tires, his fingers drumming an uneven rhythm on the sticky tabletop, a nervous tick I'd never witnessed before. Barely, I muttered, stirring a third packet of sugar into my lukewarm coffee. The spoon clinked against the ceramic, the sound too loud in the otherwise empty diner. Markets dried up. Been living off savings for 2 months now. I kept silent about the foreclosure notice tucked in my glove compartment, and the creditor calls I'd been dodging. Dennis nodded, his expression unreadable in the dim light. We'd done dozens of hauls together back in the day, the kind of friendship forged in endless midnight drives and shared thermoses of coffee. But Head vanished 6 months ago, stopped answering calls, dropped off the radar completely. Now here he was, looking like he'd been through hell and barely crawled back. "I've got a lead for you," he said, leaning forward. The overhead light caught his eyes, and for a moment, they looked almost black. "Good money, night work. You interested?" I raised an eyebrow, trying to ignore the way my stomach tightened. "What's the catch?" Dennis' lips twitched into something that might have been a smile. Always a skeptic. He reached into his worn leather jacket and pulled out a manila envelope, stained with what looked like motor oil. His hands trembled slightly as he slid it across the table. "Gas station gig, middle of nowhere, Montana. $65 an hour, all cash." The envelope seemed to absorb the diner's light like a black hole, sitting there between my half-empty coffee cup and the sticky menu. "Middle of nowhere, huh?" I tried to keep my voice casual. "That's convenient talk for shady." "You're not wrong," he admitted, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. The fluorescent light above our booth flickered, casting strange shadows across his face. "But you're not exactly swimming in options, are you?" I stared at the envelope but didn't touch it. Something about the way Dennis' hands hovered over the table, almost protectively, set my teeth on edge. "Why don't you take it?" I asked, watching his reaction carefully. He laughed, a short, hollow sound that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. "Did my time there," he said, his fingers unconsciously tracing a scar on his wrist I hadn't noticed before. "Let's just say I've had enough." The air between us felt heavy, charged with something I couldn't name. Outside, a distant truck's horn echoed like a warning. "What's the job, really?" Dennis' smile faded, replaced by something that looked almost like fear. He gestured to the envelope. "Read the shift rules, Greg. You'll figure it out." He stood abruptly, chair scraping against the linoleum. "You're going to want to follow them," he said, pulling his jacket tighter though the diner was warm, almost uncomfortably so. As he walked away, a cold draft swept through the diner, making the lights flicker again. The bell above the door chimed as he left, the sound lingering too long in the stale air. I stared at the envelope, my fingers twitching to pick it up. When I finally did, it felt wrong in my hands, too heavy, like it was filled with something denser than paper. Inside, scrawled in jagged handwriting that looked like it had been written in a hurry, was a list of 9 shift rules, each one more bizarre than the last, each one making less sense than the previous. But as I read them, I felt something settle in my good a cold, heavy certainty that these weren't suggestions. They were warnings. The drive to Montana stretched endlessly through a landscape that seemed to swallow everything whole. My GPS had died 3 hours back, the on-screen flickering once before going dark, leaving me with nothing but Dennis' hastily scrawled directions and a map that felt outdated the moment I crossed the state line. Fields of wheat gave way to barren plains, the horizon blurring into nothingness under a sky that looked too big, too empty. The sun had set hours ago, leaving behind a darkness so complete it felt like driving through ink. My headlights carved a tunnel through the black, illuminating empty fields and the occasional dead tree, their branches reaching toward the sky like gnarled fingers. The radio had stopped picking up signals miles back, leaving me alone with the hum of tires and the quiet whisper of wind through a crack in my passenger window that ID never noticed before. The fill station appeared so suddenly I nearly missed the turn. One moment, there was nothing but dark. The next, a lonely island of flickering neon pierced the night station. The sign above read "Last Fill Station" in blocky letters, some burnt out to spell Latifstein instead. Below it, a smaller sign swung lazily in a wind I couldn't feel. Gas, groceries, garage. The E in garage flickered erratically, like a dying firefly. I pulled my rig into the lot, the tires crunching over what sounded like a mixture of gravel and broken glass. The sound echoed oddly in the still air, each crunch seeming to last longer than it should. The place looked abandoned at first glance. No cars, no other trucks, just endless rows of empty parking spaces stretched into the darkness. The only signs of life were the humming neon and a strange mechanical creaking from somewhere behind the building that reminded me of an old playground swing moving in the wind. But as I killed the engine, letting silence settle around as like a heavy blanket, I caught sight of a dim light coming from inside the store. It pulsed slightly, as if breathing, casting strange shadows across the dusty windows. The temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees the moment I stepped out of my truck. The air felt wrong, somehow thicker, like trying to breathe underwater. My boots echoed on the cracked concrete as I approached the entrance, each step sounding unnaturally loud in the quiet. The interior was a time capsule from decades past. Rows of dusty shelves stocked with faded packages, their labels so old I couldn't make out the brands. The linoleum floor was worn to the backing in places, creating paths that led to nowhere. Behind a counter that had seen better days sat an ancient cash register, its metal dulled with age and what looked like rust, though something about the reddish-brown stains made us look away quickly. A man in a grease-stained jumpsuit stood behind the counter, his presence so sudden I had to stifle a startled jump. I hadn't seen him when I first walked in, though there was nowhere he could have come from. His eyes were bloodshot and wary, seeming to reflect the fluorescent lights above in a way that made them look almost yellow. "You the new guy?" he asked without looking up from something he was writing in a ledger, his pen scratching against the paper with a sound like fingernails on skin. "Guess so," I replied, holding up the envelope Dennis had given as. The paper seemed to pulse in my hand, like something inside was trying to get out. He nodded slowly and gestured toward a door marked garage with peeling black paint. "Tools are in the back. Truck pulls in, you fix it. Simple enough." His voice had an odd quality to it, like it was coming from somewhere much further away than the few feet between us. "What about the rules?" I asked, struggling to keep my voice steady. The fluorescent light above flickered, and for a moment, his shadow on the wall behind him seemed to move independently, stretching and twisting before snapping back to normal. His eyes flicked up to meet mine, and I immediately wished they hadn't. There was something wrong about them, something that made my stomach turn. "You follow them," he said, the words seeming to echo slightly, though that should have been impossible in the small space. "And if I don't?" He smiled then, a gesture that never reached his eyes and revealed teeth that looked just slightly too sharp. You won't make that mistake twice. The words hung in the air like a physical thing, seeming to drop the temperature another few degrees. Do not respond to any voices calling your name, even if you recognize them. Rule 5: never go outside to investigate strange lights, no matter how close they seem or what shapes you think you see in them. If they start forming patterns, close your eyes and count to 137. Rule 6: if someone asks for directions to a town you've never heard of, send them west and close. Rule 7: at 4:07 a.m., check the security cameras. If you see yourself on the screen, do not leave the room until sunrise. If you see yourself smiling, lock the door and pray. Rule 8: if the phone rings after 143 a.m., let it ring out. Do not answer it. If it rings more than 13 times, unplug it. If it continues ringing after being unplugged, see Rule 4. Rule 9: always leave a full gas can near pump 4 before your shift ends. If the previous can is empty, do not look inside it to check for residue. Additional notes: the bathroom key is in the top drawer. Only use the bathroom between 2 a.m. and 3 a.m. If you hear children laughing, ignore it. We don't serve families after midnight. The coffee machine in the break room is for display only. Do not attempt to use it. As I read the last rule, the overhead bulb flickered violently, plunging the room into a fleeting darkness. When the light stuttered back to life, I could have sworn the handwriting on the page had subtly shifted, becoming more jagged, imbued with a sense of raw urgency. A frigid draft snaked around the back of my neck, carrying the faint, unsettling echo of distant laughter. The incessant dripping had ceased. I checked my watch. 11:58 p.m. Less than 20 minutes until the first rule would demand my attention. My hands trembled as I retrieved my notepad, determined to transcribe the rules, not trusting my phone to function when I desperately needed it. The pencil slipped in my clammy grip, distorting the letters, making them appear as if they were attempting to crawl off the page. From somewhere in the inky blackness beyond the station came the low, guttural rumble of an approaching engine. I glanced at the wall of tools, trying to anchor myself to their familiar shapes rather than succumb to the growing shadows that danced between them. The engine sound intensified, drawing nearer, and with it came another sound, a high-pitched whine that set my teeth on edge. My watch clicked over to 11:59 p.m. My shift had officially begun. The rumble of an approaching engine pulled I from my nervous pacing. My watch read 12:15 a.m., its digital display casting a sickly green glow in the oppressive darkness. 2 minutes until I needed to extinguish the neon sign. The shift rules had been explicit about the timing: not a minute earlier, not a minute later. The truck, materializing out of the night, moved with an unsettling wrongness. It rolled into the lot with an unnatural smoothness, as if its tires barely grazed the asphalt. The headlights sliced through the darkness like surgical blades, but the beams seemed to bend slightly, creating impossible shadows that defied logic. It was an older model Peterbilt. Its once blue paint now faded to a color that evoked bruised skin, with a trailer that seemed to absorb the station's lights rather than reflect them. As it lumbered beneath the flickering neon sign, my heart hammered against my ribs. Where the license plate should have been was only a blank, dark void that my eyes refused to focus on. Rule number 2 screamed in my mind: if you see a truck without a license plate, pull in. Serve it immediately, but never look at the driver. The truck shuddered to a halt at pump 3, the engine settling into an idle that sounded more like labored breathing than machinery. The temperature around I plummeted with startling speed, and I watched my breath clouding in front of my face. The driver's door creaked open with a sound akin to screaming metal. I kept my eyes resolutely fixed on the ground, watching as a shadow spilled out of the cab. It stretched and distorted across the concrete, far longer than it should have been given the station's meager lighting. The figure that cast it moved with a jerking, unnatural grace, like a puppet manipulated by unseen strings. "Fill it up," the voice rasped, and my blood turned to ice. It wasn't a human voice, it sounded like several voices layered upon each other, some speaking slightly faster or slower than the others, creating a discordant echo that made my ears throb. The words seemed to hang in the air, visible for a fleeting moment as dark smoke before dissipating into nothing. "Fill it up," I repeated mechanically, the only response the shift rules allowed. My hands shook violently as I grabbed the pump handle, the metal so cold it nearly adhered to my skin. I forced myself to focus on the simple, repetitive task: insert nozzle, squeeze handle, watch numbers climb. But everything felt profoundly wrong. The fuel gauge spun backward, the numbers increasing in impossible sequences: 66, 666, 666, 6666. The air grew thick and heavy with each passing second, pressing against my skin like wet velvet. From the corner of my eye, I could see the figure standing perfectly still, its shape seeming to blur and shift when I wasn't looking directly at it. Something about its proportions was inherently wrong: limbs too long, angles too sharp. My watch beeped insistently: 12:17 a.m. Time to turn off the station night sign, but the pump was still running, numbers still spinning in their impossible dance. Cold sweat trickled down my back as I realized I couldn't possibly accomplish both tasks at once. The shift rules demanded I serve the plateless truck immediately, but they were equally clear about the sign's precise timing. The figure turned its head toward I with a motion far too smooth and fluid to be natural. Though I kept my eyes firmly downcast, I could feel its gaze like a stream of ice water down my spine. The numbers on the pump finally screeched to a halt at 66666. All set, I managed to choke out, the words feeling like shards of glass in my throat. Without uttering a single word, the figure reached into its coat. What emerged wasn't a hand or money or anything I could properly process. My mind simply refused to register what I saw, leaving only a vague impression of movement and pure wrongness. Something was placed on the pump, something that ticked wetly against the cold metal. I backed away, keeping my eyes glued to the ground as the figure retreated to the truck. The door slammed shut, the sound echoing unnaturally, and the engine roared to life, but it was no longer just an engine. It was something alive, something ravenous. The truck pulled away, but instead of driving down the road, it simply dissolved, like a dark stain being absorbed into the station night. I stood frozen until my watch beeped again, a stark reminder of the sign: 12:18 a.m. 1 minute late. As I rushed towards the power switch, a soft singing began to drift from above. The shift rules flashed in my mind: if you hear singing while doing this, don't look up. The melody was beautiful, achingly so, sung in a language that made my teeth ache and my eyes water. Every instinct screamed at I to look up, to find the source of that otherworldly music. I kept my eyes forward and through the switch. The singing ceased abruptly, replaced by a sound like wet wings folding. When I finally dared to glance at pump 3, there was no sign of the truck's visit, save for a strange black substance where it had been parked. It looked like oil at first, but as I watched, it moved, shifting and bubbling as if trying to form shapes. I hurried back to the garage, but not before seeing one of those shapes become almost recognizable, almost human, almost like a face I knew, my reflection grinning back at me from the oil that wasn't oil, wearing an expression I'd never worn. At 2:34 a.m., the Latif Stein had settled into an eerie quiet that pressed against my ears like cotton wool. The encounter with the plateless truck had left I shaken, but following the rules had proven effective, even if each passing hour made I question my sanity more. ID taken to wiping down the store's counter obsessively, the rhythmic motion helping to calm my nerves. The ancient radio behind the register had been playing static for the past hour, but occasionally, I could swear I heard voices in the white noise, whispered conversations in languages that made my head throb. The security camera monitor on the wall showed empty pumps and vacant parking spaces, though sometimes the images would glitch, showing split-second frames of things that couldn't be their dark figures standing motionless between the pumps, children playing hopscotch with strange symbols, my own face staring back from places I hadn't been. The coffee machine in the break room had started making gurgling sounds about 10 minutes ago, despite being unplugged. I remembered the note about it being for display only and kept my distance. That's when the first light appeared. It started as a pinprick in the darkness beyond the windows, like a star had descended to hover just above the horizon. But it grew quickly, impossibly fast, until the entire fill station was bathed in a light so white it hurt to look at. It poured through the windows like liquid fire, casting shadows that pointed in the wrong directions. Shift Rules 5 thundered through my mind: never go outside to investigate strange lights, no matter how close they seem or what shapes you think you see in them. I dropped behind the counter, my heart hammering against my ribs. The light intensified until even the shadows seemed to glow, and with it came a sounded deep, resonant hum that vibrated through my bones and made my teeth ache. It was almost musical, but the notes were wrong, playing in scales that shouldn't exist. Then came the tapping, at first gentle, like fingers drumming against glass, but it grew more insistent, more rhythmic. The windows began to vibrate in their frames, the glass rippling like the surface of a pond. Through squinted eyes, I could see shapes moving in the light outside, tall, impossibly thin figures that seemed to bend in ways that violated geometry. The humming changed pitch, becoming deeper, more urgent. The radio's static cleared for a moment, and a voice came through, distorted but clearly calling my name. It sounded like Dennis, but wrong, like his voice was being played backward and forward simultaneously. The light began to shift, moving around the building with purpose. I could track its movement by the way shadows danced across the ceiling, shadows that sometimes had too many limbs, too many angles. It paused at the garage, and I heard the tools on the wall begin to rattle in their holdings, the sound reminiscent of teeth chattering. When the light reached pump 4, where ID left the gas can as required by Shift Rules 9, the humming reached a crescendo that made my nose bleed. The liquid in the can became visible through the metal, glowing like molten gold for a split second. I saw what looked like handprints pressing against the windows from the outside, hundreds of them at every possible angle, some far too small to be human, others large enough to cover entire panes. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, everything stopped. The light vanished, not fading but simply ceasing to exist between one heartbeat and the next. The humming cut off so abruptly that my ears popped. The radio returned to its regular static, though now it sounded almost like laughter. I stayed crouched behind the counter for what felt like hours, my ragged breathing too loud in the renewed silence. When I finally found the courage to stand, my legs shaking, the parking lot was empty. The windows showed no signs of the handprints that had covered them moments before, but the gas can ID left at pump 4 was gone. In its place was a small, metallic object that caught the fluorescent lights in ways that made my eyes hurt. It looked like a coin, but the symbols engraved on it seemed to move when I wasn't looking directly at them. I didn't touch it. Some part of I knew that whatever it wasn't meant for human hands, that much was clear. As I backed away slowly, I heard the coffee machine in the break room sputter back to life. But this time, what dripped into the pot wasn't coffee at all. It was thick, viscous, and dark as pitch, and it moved with a life of its own, coalescing into shapes that looked disturbingly like letters. I didn't linger to decipher what message it was trying to spell out. By 312 a.m., The crushing weight of solitude had become almost unbearable, a physical pressure on my chest. The truck stop's oppressive silence buzzed in my ears like a swarm of angry insects, broken only by the occasional creak of the building settling, or at least, that's what I desperately tried to convince myself the sounds were. The garage felt significantly colder than the rest of the fill station. Cold enough that my breath puffed out invisible clouds despite the desert night outside being relatively warm. I'd been attempting to keep myself occupied with mindless tasks, meticulously organizing tools that seemed to subtly rearrange themselves when I wasn't directly observing them. The wrench clutched in my hands was inexplicably ice-cold, its metal surface now covered in tiny, intricate engravings that definitely hadn't been there even an hour ago, complex patterns that made my eyes ache if I tried to trace them. That's when I heard a gentle, almost polite tapping sound, like knuckles rapping softly against glass. My stomach plummeted as the realization hit me it was coming from the garage door. Tap, 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 each sound precisely spaced, far too precise to be natural or random. I froze instantly, every muscle locking up tight as my mind frantically raced through the rules. The one about knocking wasn't explicitly there, but Rule 4 echoed ominously in my head: if a truck pulls into the garage and honks twice, lock the doors and wait in the supply closet until dawn. This wasn't honking, thought. His was something entirely different, something far more unsettling. "Hello?" I called out, immediately regretting breaking the oppressive silence. My voice sounded alien and wrong in the vast, empty garage, like it belonged to someone else entirely. The tapping ceased abruptly, replaced by the low, guttural hum of an engine idling just outside, but it wasn't any engine I'd ever encountered before. The sound was too organic, too disturbingly alive, like something massive and monstrous breathing heavily just beyond the door. The temperature plunged another 10 degrees, the chill sinking deep into my bones. The tools hanging on the walls began to vibrate, their shadows twisting and dancing in ways that defied the known laws of physics. Some of them even looked like they were actively trying to peel themselves off the wall. I backed away slowly, my eyes glued to the ominous metal garage door. The engine sound deepened, intensifying, rattling the tools until they began to sing, creating a discordant symphony of metal on metal that sounded disturbingly like screaming. My heel bumped against something unexpectedly soft instead of the cold concrete floor, and I spun around to find that the supply closet door had inexplicably moved. I could have sworn it was on the opposite side of the garage just moments earlier. The door hung slightly ajar, revealing darkness so complete and absolute that it looked almost solid, like a tangible thing. The humming outside grew louder, more intense, then cut off abruptly, plunging everything into absolute silence. For a moment, there was total silence, the kind that felt like a held breath before a scream. Then came the honk-shonk, honk too sharp, deliberate blasts that weren't quite right, too deep, too resonant, like they were emanating from something that was only pretending to be a truck. The rules screamed in my head, a cacophony of warnings as I bolted for the supply closet, slamming the door shut behind me and throwing the flimsy lock. The tiny room was pitch black, utterly devoid of light, and reeked of old motor oil and something sharply metallic. The air was stale and thick, making each breath feel like drowning in sludge. I clutched my wrench tightly, wielding it like a weapon, though some deeply buried part of me knew it would be utterly useless against whatever malevolent presence was lurking out there. The honks came again, louder and more insistent this time, pressing against the thin walls. I gritted my teeth, forcing myself to stay put, to obey the rules that were now my only lifeline. Then the tapping started again, this time directly on the closet door. Tap, tap, tap. It wasn't possible nothing had entered the garage. I would have heard the door open, would have heard the heavy footsteps. Yet something was undeniably out there, just inches away, separated from me by a thin wooden door that suddenly felt as substantial as tissue paper. "Greg," The voice that whispered my name was utterly, terrifyingly inhuman. It was mechanical and organic all at once, like a machine trying to imitate flesh, or flesh trying to imitate a machine. It had that same unsettling, multi-layered quality as the plateless truck's driver, but underneath, I could distinctly hear something I recognized: Dennis' voice, distorted and wrong but unmistakably Dennis. I clamped my hand tightly over my mouth to stifle a scream that threatened to erupt from my throat. The darkness in the closet felt alive now, pressing against me like wet velvet, suffocating and cloying. Something brushed lightly against my ankle, something cold and smooth that retreated quickly when I kicked out at it blindly. "Greg, come out. Your shift isn't over," the voice said, closer now, as if the thing speaking was pressing its mouth directly against the door. "We have so much to discuss about the shift rules." The tapping stopped abruptly, and the silence that followed was somehow even more terrifying, more oppressive. I stayed frozen in place, barely breathing, until the first faint, gray light of dawn began to seep tentatively through the closet's tiny ventilation grate. Only then did I dare to reach out and slowly, cautiously open the door. The garage was completely empty, but a disturbing trail of thick, black fluid led from the center of the floor out into the empty parking lot. It wasn't oil. It moved slightly when I looked at it, forming fleeting shapes that resembled letters for split seconds before dissolving back into formless, oily puddles. The air reeked of ozone and burning rubber, a nauseating combination. On the wall where the shift rules had been meticulously posted, something had added a new line in fresh, glistening ink: Rule 10: when you hear your old friend's voice, remember Dennis never made it home. The ink was still wet and vividly red, like fresh blood. The digital display of my watch flicked to 407 a.m. with an almost accusatory beep, a digital finger pointing at my negligence. Rule 7 loomed ominously in my mind like a descending guillotine blade at 4:07 a.m. Check the security cameras. If you see yourself on the screen, do not leave the room until sunrise. If you see yourself smiling, lock the door and pray. The security office was a cramped, claustrophobic closet of a room tucked away behind the store counter, barely bigger than a broom closet. The door creaked open with a sound that made my skin crawl and my stomach churn, not the normal groan of old, worn hinges, but something else. The windows showed no signs of the handprints that had covered them moments before, but the gas can ID left at pump 4 was gone. In its place was a small, metallic object that caught the fluorescent lights in ways that made my eyes hurt. It looked like a coin, but the symbols engraved on it seemed to move when I wasn't looking directly at them. I didn't touch it. Some part of I knew that whatever it was crawl and my stomach churn, not the normal groan of old, worn hinges, but something else. The windows showed no signs of the handprints that had covered them moments before, but the gas can ID left at pump 4 was gone. In its place was a small, metallic object that caught the fluorescent lights in ways that made my eyes hurt. It looked like a coin, but the symbols engraved on it seemed to move when I wasn't looking directly at them. I didn't touch it. Some part of I knew that whatever it was bad news. The hinges on the security office door whined in protest as I pushed it open, but it was a different sound, something almost like words spoken backward. The monitor setup was ancient, for screens arranged in a grid, their surfaces coated with a layer of grime that seemed to writhe and shift when I looked straight at them. The clock on the wall ticked with an unnerving loudness, each second echoing in the confined space. It read 407, but the second hand stuttered and jerked, sometimes ticking backward for a fleeting moment before resuming its course. The air in the room was thick, almost gelatinous, with a faint metallic tang of copper. My hands trembled as I reached for the controls, the metal shockingly cold beneath my fingertips. The first camera showed the empty parking lot, but something was off about the image. The painted lines of the parking spaces curved subtly, creating patterns that strained my eyes if I stared too long. Occasionally, shadows flickered across the screen, too fast to follow, moving in ways that defied logic. Camera 2 focused on the gas pumps. They appeared normal at first glance, but as I watched, the numbers on their displays began to cycle randomly, occasionally flashing symbols that were definitely not numbers. The gas can ID replaced at pump 4 was still visible, but its shadow stretched in the wrong direction, defying the light source. Camera 3 revealed the garage. The tools hanging on the wall seemed to be arranged differently than I remembered, coalescing into something disturbingly like a face in profile. As I watched, one of the wrenches twitched almost imperceptibly, like a finger trying to curl. Then I switched to camera 4, showing the store interior. There I was, standing motionless in the middle of the snack aisle, but I was also in the security office. I hadn't been in the store proper for at least an hour. The figure on the screen wore my clothes, matched my build, but something about it felt fundamentally wrong. Its posture was too stiff, its angles too sharp and unnatural. As I watched, paralyzed with dread, the figure's head turned toward the camera with a motion too fluid, too smooth to be human. Its face-me-face wore an expression I'd never seen reflected in any mirror. The smile was impossibly wide, stretching literally from ear to ear, the teeth visible in that grotesque grin needle-sharp. It raised one hand slowly, pointing directly at the Camerino, not at the camera, at me. Its mouth moved, forming words I couldn't hear, but instinctively understood. I scrambled backward, nearly sending the desk chair crashing to the floor. The shift rules burned in my brain: do not leave the room until sunrise. I slammed the office door shut and threw the lock, my heart hammering against my ribs, threatening to burst free. The room seemed to shrink around me, the walls pulsing subtly with each frantic beat of my heart. The monitors cast a sickly blue glow that deepened the shadows in the corners, making them appear almost solid. On screen 4, my doppelganger had moved closer to the camera, its smile widening to an impossible extent, and a dark, viscous liquid, not blood, something thicker and darker, began to drip from its eyes. Its movements were jerky now, like stop-motion animation played at the wrong speed. The other cameras began to show similar figures, all wearing my face, all wearing that terrible smile. They appeared at the pumps, in the garage, in the parking lot, each one facing the nearest camera, pointing accusingly at me. Their mouths moved in unison, silently forming words I was thankful I couldn't hear. The temperature in the office plummeted with alarming speed until frost began to bloom on the screens. The clock on the wall spun wildly, its hands a blur like propeller blades before stopping abruptly at 407. The air grew so thick it felt like trying to breathe underwater, each gasp a struggle. From somewhere outside the office came the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate steps that didn't quite match any human gait. They moved up and down the store aisles, drawing steadily closer to the office door. Something scraped against the wood, not knocking, but the sound of two long fingers trailing slowly across its surface. "Greg." My own voice called from the other side, distorted and wrong, dripping with malice. "Don't you want to see your new smile?" I huddled in the corner, as far from the door as I could get, watching the monitors with burning, terrified eyes. The first faint rays of dawn crept through the office window like tentative fingers, turning the frost on the monitors into glittering diamonds. The station night shift was over, but the fill station felt different now, irrevocably changed, as if the darkness had seeped into its very foundations, poisoning it from within. My doppelgangers had vanished from the cameras when the sun rose, blinking out of existence between one frame and the next, but they'd left things behind: dark handprints smeared on the walls, strange, unsettling symbols carved into the floor, and worst of all, a lingering, pervasive sense that they hadn't really gone anywhere. They were just waiting, biding their time. I gathered my things with trembling hands, leaving the wrench where ID found it. The metal had grown strangely hot during the night, and the strange engravings now pulsed with a faint, sickly light, a malevolent energy thrumming beneath its surface. My jacket felt heavier than it had the night before, as if something unseen had slipped into its pockets while I wasn't looking, some dark souvenir of the night's horrors. The morning light streaming through the windows should have been reassuring, but something was wrong with its beams bent at impossible angles, casting shadows that moved independently of their sources, mocking the laws of physics. The store's shelves had rearranged themselves during the night, the aisles now forming a pattern that looked disturbingly like a massive, unblinking eye when viewed from above, staring accusingly at me. As I headed for the door, a flicker of movement caught my eye. The store's security mirror showed my reflection, but it was delayed by several seconds, the movements jerky and unnatural. Sometimes it would pause entirely, its head tilted at an unnatural angle, watching me with eyes that looked increasingly less human, more predatory. I broke into a run, bursting through the front doors into the relative safety of the morning air. The parking lot was empty except for my truck, but even it looked different, tainted by the dawn light. The chrome had dulled to a gunmetal gray, and the paint job seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, just like the plateless truck from the night before. As I climbed into the cab, something made me check the rearview mirror. My heart nearly stopped. There, at the edge of the lot, stood a figurino. Not one figure, many figures, all wearing my face, all smiling that impossible smile. They stood perfectly still, their forms seeming to flicker and shift in the morning light. I jammed the key into the ignition, and the engine roared to life, but the sound was wrong, deeper, more organic, like the thing that had visited the garage. The radio came on by itself, playing nothing but static and what sounded like distant screaming. I slammed the accelerator, tires squealing on the pavement. The figures didn't move as I sped past them, but their heads turned in unison to follow my departure, necks rotating far beyond what should have been possible. In the mirror, I could see their smiles growing wider, until their faces split like overripe fruit. The truck stop receded behind me, but something else took its place. Lights in the sky, bright and white and impossible to ignore. They paced my truck, keeping perfect formation no matter how fast I drove. The radio static organized itself into words. Shift rules followed, but knowledge gained comes with a price. The voice was Dennis, but layered with something else, something that made my teeth vibrate and my vision blur. The lights drew closer, their formation creating patterns that reminded me of the symbols ID seen carved into the garage tools. Welcome to the night shift, Greg. The permanent shift, the voice said. I drove faster, but the lights kept pace effortlessly. Sometimes I would swoop low enough that I could see shapes within them, faces I recognized, faces that shouldn't exist, and things that weren't faces at all. The truck's engine had developed a new sound now, a rhythmic thumping like a massive heartbeat. The temperature in the cab dropped until my breath came out as frost, and the windows began to ice over with patterns that looked like screaming faces. From somewhere behind me came the familiar sound: honk. Honk. I didn't need to look to know what was coming up fast in my Marorsa plateless truck. Its paint the color of bruised flesh, driven by something wearing Dennis' face, or what was left of it. The shift rules had warned us about leaving, they just never mentioned it was already too late once you'd arrived. I'm still driving. The lights follow me everywhere now, waiting. Sometimes I catch glimpses of my reflection in the windshield, glimpses of a smile that grows wider every day. The radio only plays static, but in it, I can hear voices reading out shift rules, new shift rules, different shift rules. And sometimes, late at night, when the moon is hidden and the roads are empty, I see the last fill station sign glowing in the distance. It appears